Hello, everyone. If you could take your seat, we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint Baker Institute Carnegie Conference on Religious Authority in the Middle East, Implications for U.S. Policy. My name is Sarah Yerkes. I'm a fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment. And we at Carnegie are honored that Kadir and his team asked us to serve as the Washington host for the launch of this very interesting body of work. We're looking forward to a day full of discussion at the intersection of academia and policy, looking at the role that religious actors play within their own societies and how U.S. policymakers can better understand those dynamics. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kadir, who will provide a more formal introduction to the conference. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Sarah. As the Baker Institute, we want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for hosting us here. And in particular, I want to thank Sarah and Nathan Brown for making this happen. And I also want to acknowledge Henry Luce Foundation for their support for our study, without which our study wouldn't be successful. And I also want to say that I feel incredibly privileged and humbled to be here, to be speaking at this venue and in front of a distinguished audience that not only includes my esteemed colleagues in this project, but also others like Sarah, Nathan, Sean, and Peter. If and when I say something wrong, I'm safe in the knowledge that they will correct me. Religion and religious authority are incredibly valuable political resources, especially at a time when religion's prominence has risen in recent years and decades in the political arena, something that we know in particular, but also over in the Middle East and North Africa region. Various religio-political actors, such as Islamists and fundamentalists or Salafi groups, and governments use religion in one form or another for their political purposes throughout the region, because authority in Islam is decentralized and hierarchical, with the exception of some Shiite group circles. Dynamics of a free market of religion and religious competition define politics-religion relationship across the region. Yet despite its centrality to a well-grounded understanding, conception of how religion and politics interact, and to understanding the motivations behind religious actors' actions, we lack a comprehensive analysis of this key concept of Islamic authority, religious authority in the Middle East. Our study examines the nature of religious authority in contemporary Middle East, and we ask, who speaks for Islam in the Middle East, and who wields religious authority? Three key observations about the region's religious space motivated our study. First, Islamist actors across the region have enjoyed widespread electoral popularity for decades. Does this electoral popularity translate into religious favorability and authority for Islamists? This is a very important and politically pertinent question. Second, state-affiliated religious leaders are generally assumed to lack the charisma, intrigue, and authority other religious leaders are deemed to possess because of their proximity to political power. So state affiliation is presumed to undermine their authority. How much influence and authority do state religious officials actually have? And lastly, there are some strong undercurrents of extremism in the region, sometimes violently, as evidenced by the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates. But is there a strong societal support base for extremists among the broader populations in the region? So as part of this study, we conducted an original 12-country online public opinion survey that asked about 16,500 respondents their views on more than 80 religious leaders from across the region. These leaders hailed from quite different backgrounds. Some were traditional religious scholars, others state-affiliated, Sufis, televangelists, and others were more politically oriented, like the Islamists, Salafis, and Jihadis. Just a quick note about the survey. Our survey is not representative at the national level. So there's proportionately male, more educated, and more urban. However, on some other variables, especially that relate to religion, religious attitudes, religious behavior, it is fairly comparable to the broader populations that they're drawn from. So, and we have more information, detailed information about the survey in our appendix online. Our survey included direct questions about the respondents' approval of and trust in these religious leaders in every country. But our study went beyond asking directly. We know this is a sensitive topic, especially given the, in some contexts, authoritarian nature of regimes. So not everyone is going to come out and reveal their true preferences in our survey. So to this end, we decided to measure this more indirectly. So we used endorsement experiments. This experimental design allowed us to make a series of religious statements the focus of respondents' evaluation instead of the religious leaders themselves. So we would give them a statement, a religious statement, and we would attribute that statement to a particular religious leader. And we varied this for each respondent. So we had 14 this kind of question, 14 endorsement experiments, and we had 13 leaders plus a no endorsement option as the baseline to compare to. So this combination of alternative methods to map religious authority in the region enabled us to reach a more comprehensive set of conclusions than we would be able to using by a single method. The results depict a complex religious space in the Middle East that reflects its citizens' nuanced approach toward religion and religion-politics relationship. So we have three main findings. The first one is that we find that the popularity and religious influence of Islamist actors notably vary across the region. On one hand, Islamist figures in our survey received fairly high levels of approval from respondents in most countries in our survey. Likewise, they were found to be trustworthy in most countries in our survey. Again, there are a couple countries in which Islamists were not as much favored, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, for example. But in most other countries, they were. On the other hand, survey respondents were notably more lukewarm about Islamists when their views are put into specific context. In terms of religio-political issues, we asked them indirectly in the endorsement experiments. Islamist names typically garnered a negative endorsement score in our endorsement experiments, indicating that respondents were less likely to agree with a statement when they saw the name of an Islamist figure. A second finding of our study is that we fundamentally challenge the conventional wisdom about the influence of state religious actors. Our study shows that state-affiliated religious leaders have largely outperformed our expectations. And to begin with, this was also our own expectation as a team in this study. This finding holds true, and this is true both in trust, being trustworthy, and having the approval of respondents. And this is true almost without exception in every single country in our study, which I thought was impressive. This finding also holds true with the endorsement experiments. Importantly, state-affiliated religious officials have the most influence in countries where the state employs religion and religious discourse as a key element of its national identity in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Iran, and Jordan. However, considered in tandem with the relatively weak performance of Islamists in our study, especially in endorsement experiments, this finding suggests that the support that state religious actors received from respondents in our survey is conditional upon ensuring a non-partisan approach to religion. And we had another experiment in our survey which actually reaffirmed our finding in this part of our survey. So we were pretty confident in our result. Maintaining that non-partisan position is key to their stature as legitimate religious authorities from the perspective of respondents in our survey. Lastly, the most concerning finding in our study is that extremist religious discourse has a sizable audience. respondents in our survey did not express support for local or transnational extremist figures when asked directly in our survey in the approval questions and trustworthiness. And we asked about al-Baghdadi, ISIS Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi, in every single country, and he did not get any traction in direct questions. However, endorsement question revealed a dramatically different picture. In several countries, al-Baghdadi was among the most favorably viewed religious leaders when asked indirectly in endorsement experiments. So when we asked their views on different religious statements, people in several countries were more likely to agree with this statement when they saw the name of Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi. And this was particularly pronounced in Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Morocco. And these are the very countries that sent the highest number of foreign fighters into Syria to fight alongside the Islamic State. So we have external validation of our finding in our study. So what do these findings suggest? It is important to caution against securitizing U.S. foreign policy engagement with religion in the Middle East because it carries a serious risk of delegitimizing the local religious actors who are involved in such engagements. There are a lot of counter-violent extremism programs that are going on. So this is particularly a concern for state religious officials who are viewed and instrumentalized as agents of moderation. Religion permeates various aspects of life in societies across the Middle East. And if you follow a lot of these surveys, and this was also evident in our survey, we asked the same question: how important religion is in your life? And overwhelming majorities in every country throughout the region indicate that religion is very important in their lives. So in that sense, this is very important. So reducing religion to extremism only is problematic. Reducing it to extremism and extremist violence alone compromises the ability of U.S. foreign policy to engage with a much larger population and on a broader set of issues. Relatedly, our research shows that state religious actors enjoy significant influence and power that hinge on local circumstances. As such, state religious officials' potential to act as legitimate religious authorities offers an opportunity to promote reform in social issues such as education, women's rights, and pluralism, and democratization more broadly that are not directly related to extremism in the society. Examples of such policies have been employed in countries like Tunisia and Jordan in recent years in regard to equal inheritance and family planning. Simultaneously, however, this influence and power of state religious authorities is precarious because of its proximity to political power. So the way to engage them or the way to empower them must be undertaken delicately. Lastly, the mixed performance of Islamist actors in our study reflects their complicated legacy throughout the region. Even when Islamists and to some degree Salafists fail to resonate strongly with respondents as religious authorities in our survey, there is extensive evidence for the support that they enjoy as leaders in most countries throughout the region. So it is important to recognize that they represent a particular societal bloc, and just ignoring them entirely, not recognizing them as legitimate actors in their societies is problematic because they're simply not going to go away. So such nuanced support for Islamists, recognizing them as legitimate political actors in their sort of broad appeal to religious values, but not so much as religious authorities directly. That this nuanced support for Islamists underscores the importance of engaging them in efforts to find long-lasting solutions to major public policy issues in regional countries. Their absence from these processes carries the risk of delegitimizing reform efforts right from the beginning. The recent public debates on equal inheritance in Tunisia show that Islamists can play the role of spoilers in social reform efforts, just as they can reinforce reform and democratization efforts like Ennahda did in the aftermath of the Jasmine Revolution. And we have an in-house expert with Sharon here who can speak to this more. So our study shows a strong strain of support that Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi enjoys in several countries in the region. While this support oftentimes does not translate into support for local extremists, and this is, I think, a very important finding, in any meaningful way, it nonetheless reveals a concerning trend and helps explain why certain countries in the region send high numbers of foreign fighters into Syria. Two important points must be raised here in light of our study. First, while immediate military action against extremist groups and violent groups may be warranted in certain contexts in order to address human suffering and geopolitical ramifications of the Islamic State presence in the region, such action should absolutely complemented by a long-term strategy to undertake broad efforts at social reform in order to curb undercurrent of support for extremism in the region. Critically, the complex nature of religious affairs should be harnessed in this process, as our study shows. In particular, religious actors who enjoy broad legitimacy as religious authorities should constitute a key element of these efforts. Second, looking at extremism and extremist violence in the region, our study shows that one of the important motivators of support for extremism in the region is U.S. Foreign policy and actions on the ground in the region. So it is of utmost importance that U.S. policy and actions in the region are calibrated with the religious landscape in mind. A region where religion is deemed to be quite important in the lives of the people, this is very important to be able to gain a little bit more traction in terms of policies on the ground. I will finish by saying that our reports, most of our reports are published. They're available outside in printed form. Help yourselves. They're also available online through the Carnegie event website, but also through the Baker Institute page. And we will have more reports and policy briefs coming in the coming weeks. So be on the watch out for those. Now I want to introduce our first keynote speaker for today, Sean Casey. Dr. Sean Casey is the director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University and a professor of the practice in Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Sean previously was U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs and the founding director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. He has also had positions at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and the Center for American Progress and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Casey has written on the ethics of the war in Iraq, as well as the role of religion in American presidential politics. He's the author of The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy versus Nixon, 1960. He's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Political Theology. He is currently working on a book on ethics and international politics, tentatively titled Niebuhr's Children. Casey holds a BA from Abilene Christian University, an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, and a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Theology in Religion and Society from Harvard Divinity School. We are very fortunate to have him here today, so please welcome Sean Casey.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Kadir and Anel and Sarah for this wonderful invitation to open up this great day of conversation and analysis of the very fascinating research that your team has done. It's an honor for me to be here this morning. I'm sorry I will not be here for the full day to hear what I'm sure will be quite interesting and engaging a conversation. But you're to be commended for this fascinating set of papers and analysis. I think you really do push the frontier of our understanding of this very important set of questions related to religious authority in the countries that you have examined. I think that the publication and dissemination marks real progress in deepening not only our understanding of religious authority among the leaders in these countries, but it's also a very nice signal that the modes of analysis available to diplomats is evolving in some very interesting and positive ways. On the one hand, I think we are light years away from what I hope was an era where earlier sets of alleged investigations began with inane questions like, why do they hate us? And can't anyone here write a counter narrative that will be effective in shutting down ISIS on Twitter? But more about that in a moment. So the good news is analysis is much more sophisticated than it was 6 years ago when I came into the State Department. The bad news is that the consumers inside the United States government who might actually be able to learn from this material, that demand has decreased. And we'll talk more about that in a moment or two. The Baker Institute has a very special place in my heart for many reasons. First of all, as many of you know, in April, almost exactly 3 years ago, in 2016, Secretary Kerry traveled to Houston at the invitation of Secretary Baker to give a keynote speech on why he decided to launch an Office of Religion and Global Affairs in his own bureau. And he outlined the case for that, and Secretary Baker was eager to provide a very large platform and context for Kerry to make that speech. I commend it to you. It's available online, where he lays out the systematic case for why the State Department needs to grow its capacity to assess religious dynamics and engage religious actors along the lines we see advocated in these papers. In many ways, that speech marked the high water mark for our office that I directed. I had the pleasure of then speaking the next day to a group of students, and also later in November 2016. So the Baker Institute is a context where these issues are naturally part of their issue set. So I'm honored and I'm grateful that you are maintaining this tradition and this deep interest in this intersection of religion and global affairs. We received a warm welcome from Ambassador Tajarian on both visits, and I remain grateful to this day for your hospitality. Likewise, a dear friend of mine, and those of you who know the Baker Institute may know William C. Martin, who's something of a legend on Rice's campus. He's now a professor of sociology emeritus, and he maintains his larger-than-life presence on the Rice campus from his post at the Baker Institute. As an aside, he is my nominee for the first Texan who should be cloned. So far, no one has picked up on that recommendation, but if you know Bill, he is one of the country's most foremost scholars of religion and public life, and he embodies Rice's deep history of producing trenchant scholarship on the public consequences of religious belief and practice around the world. Let me draw you a quick roadmap of where I want to go in my brief remarks. I hope I finish in time so we have a moment or two for Q&A if you are so motivated. My remarks are focused around 5 questions. First, who should care about your research, and how can and should you reach them? Second, what exactly is religious authority, and are the social sciences the best or only way to get at that topic? Third, if we do have a sense of what religious authority means, are we arguably in an era that might be called a time of crisis for religious authority? Fourth, what about U.S. diplomacy in the area of religion and global affairs? What is going on the inside? And finally, if religion and global affairs are on the verge of extinction in U.S. diplomacy, see how deftly I just answered my last question. Is the victorious trope of religious freedom a sufficient substitute on the part of our government? So who exactly should care about this sort of research into religious authority in the Muslim majority countries chosen? The simplest answer is that American diplomats, to the extent the heart of the work of U.S. embassies and posts is interpreting host countries back to the State Department in D.C., they should care deeply about any form of research that shed lights on the political terrain, especially in countries that comprise the current research set. But sadly, that view has never been fully socialized in the State Department's DNA. We had a 3.5-year launch of trying to socialize the notion that every embassy and post should be a consumer of this kind of analysis. We made a dent in the DNA, but we did not transform it. So we made progress in the Kerry years, but it was really over before it got fully started. The tougher question then to those of you in this project is, how do you share your results given the less than hospitable landscape for your work? Let me give you 3 pieces of very pragmatic inside the Beltway advice. First, shop it to the intelligence community. To the extent there is interest in these sort of questions, it is primarily found there today. If you talk to members of the IC, they're still doing their professional work, but they have become educators and persuaders inside this administration where they have a group of political customers who are deeply suspect of the utility of this kind of analysis. So they still care, even if the demand signal from the State Department and White House is virtually silent for their wares. Analysts still do their work on religion in and day out, even though they are often relegated to trying to educate their new political masters in the executive branch. But they still care passionately about this issue set. You're going to have to find them, and I'm willing to elaborate that pilgrimage later. Second, try to connect directly with senior career folk in the diplomatic force. In my time at State, there was nothing better for our work than an ambassador or deputy chief of mission who understood the wisdom and value of smart analysis of religious dynamics in their region or country. They actually are on email. They do respond to people on the outside, bringing analysis to them. Third, I recommend you invest time and energy in developing your own communication plan for your own product. A website is great, digitizing these papers, that is great. But in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of research and writing on religion in diplomacy. I can now say to you, much of that is of very poor quality. I still have shelves full of reports that are several years old in this space that I have not read. Much of that rightly rests unread. You cannot assume that simply because you wrote it, the right people are going to find it and be influenced by it. While I was at State, there was already beginning to be too much to read. So you have to ask yourself, who should be reading your research and how do you make it available? My next question gets more to the substance of the research, and that is, what exactly is, quote unquote, religious authority? And is social science the best or only way to get at it? Kadir, I appreciate your written remarks in introducing the work, but also your opening statement here about the nature of religious authority, because I think that's very, very helpful. I think there's a tacit acknowledgement in all the papers that religious authority is heavily dependent on the national political and religious climate. There really isn't any pure form of religious authority that can be distilled out of a national scenario and then compared and contrasted in a scientifically objective way across national boundaries. There is a reductionism with respect to religion in the State Department. What are the 5 pillars of Islam? You memorize that, you know everything you need to know about Islam in any country around the world. So this is essentially an essentialist approach. There's an essence of Islam that can be distilled and disseminated, and as long as every office and posting bureau knows that, that's all they need to know. We rejected that on the face of it in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Religion is always embedded and expressed in context, in intersection with thousands of other dynamics. There is no essence of Christianity. There is no essence of Judaism. There's no essence of Islam. The State Department is going to need a lot of time and a lot of teaching before they move beyond this sort of essentialist approach. My fear is that some consumers of your data will simply say, well, we have a poll now about religious authority, and we understand who's up and who's down, and we need to think no further. Obviously, the papers build a sophisticated historical, political, and religious interpretation around the data, which is as it should be. My fear is that among some of your potential consumers in the U.S. government, they will read these polls as if they're a presidential political poll in the United States. Somebody's up by 10 points, somebody's down by 3 points, let's run towards the person who's up 10 points. And that's not the lessons to be drawn from these very sophisticated sets of analyses. But I'm simply saying you're vulnerable to being co-opted that way. So I think that the papers themselves provide historical background and context that make interpreting the social science that much more effective. But don't rely simply on the social science to answer the question, what is religious authority? And so I'm not accusing any of the papers of doing that, but my fear is that perhaps some of your less sophisticated consumers on the inside of the government will not see that. They'll simply rely on, well, this is today's tracking poll from Politico, so we need not do any more thinking beyond who's up and who's down. So my point is that it wouldn't hurt to think more deeply about what you think religious authority means. I happen to think it can be a useful shorthand, but it gets diabolically complicated pretty fast once you scratch the surface. As I said, I fear that some of the consumers of your research, not being as sophisticated as you researchers are, may reduce religious authority to simple formulas of popular support reflected in opinion surveys, and that's not what you're trying to do. My point here is that I want to argue that opinion surveys can be good servants, but they make lousy masters. And to be a bit crass, standalone data tells us less than multiple year surveys, which yields insights into comparison over time. it would be great if Luce would fund you to go back into the field every 2 years, every 3 years, so you have comparative data, so you can see, is the Dianet, is it going down, or is it increasing its stature? And it's that comparative data that really begins to offer long-term insights about the status, the relative status of these various trend lines. So I'm happy to help Luce see the light in terms of more funding. I hope you have an opportunity to continue to go into the field and do these kinds of surveys such that you can have comparative data, say, over a decade, over 2 decades. Then you have an extra layer of really interesting sets of questions to wrestle with in terms of where are these dynamics going. Now, I'm not aware of a single convincing study on the meaning of religious authority. Any such one-size-fits-all abstract definition is doomed to failure. Depending on the particular patch of a particular religious tradition, embedded in specific political environments, systems, histories, cultures, religious authority can be inherited, it can be seized, it can be manufactured, it can be bestowed, it can be squandered, created, spent, faked, or imparted. Social science can shed light on this, but I would humbly suggest that a wider interdisciplinary conversation with historians, religious studies professors, anthropologists, etc., should be part of your ongoing conversations and analysis. Now, in asking my next question, I may be exposing myself to charges of hypocrisy or just plain old inconsistency, which I know is rarely found in academia. But with a cursory glance around the globe, it's not illogical to ask, are we in an era of significant decline in religious authority? If we rely only on survey data, it's tempting to answer in the affirmative. Certainly, a quick tour of global Christianity through the Orthodox world, through Roman Catholicism, through evangelicalism, through Pentecostalism, one could make an argument that religious authority in all of its complexity and permutations is on the decline. So there are even wider global sets of questions to be asked. And if the answer is yes, then the next question set is, well, why is this the case? The results of the country studies before us today might lend themselves to similar conclusions. Now, let me be clear, I'm not promoting this as a hard thesis, but it is worth pondering. It's also worth postponing a grand conclusion, especially when we talk to diplomats. I say this because diplomats are tempted to accept shorthand answers to cut to the chase, and the appeal of stereotypes is almost irresistible in the face of the complexity, especially when it comes to religion. Since religion is still a marginally acceptable subject for diplomats, reductive simplifying analysis can be a great relief and hence almost irresistible. To me, the real strength of these country studies is their emphasis on the unique political and religious configurations in each country. The upshot for you is to resist the temptation to draw grand theoretical conclusions, but I'm also saying, on the other hand, it's worth stepping back and saying, well, what are the dynamics and trend lines in terms of religious authority, particularly in the countries in the region that you're looking at? My fourth question is a tough one for me to ask, but I think it needs to be raised. Does the United States diplomatic apparatus today give a fig about research like this? I think the honest answer is that for the time being, no, it doesn't. And it gives me no pleasure to say that. We had a great run for 3.5 years in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, but it was not enough to change the slow-moving, change-resistant culture of what might be, indeed, the slowest changing sector in the entire federal government bureaucracy. We made a lot of friends. We made some real contributions to U.S. diplomacy, but we were swept away very, very quickly for ideological reasons in the current administration. Now, that's not to say there aren't pockets of real interest in questions like the nature of religious authority in the Middle East, but it's driven by individuals who care, not by bureaus or senior leaders that are seeking such answers. The subject captures the attention of smart people, but not enough to preserve the technical institutional capacity to absorb the diplomatic implications of these papers that existed once upon a time. But the subject of religion is not the only issue to be swept away by the current effort to restore American diplomacy's swagger. Multiple observers have noted that the current administration does not have a functioning foreign policy decision-making apparatus. Think about that for a moment. Let that sink in. As we're now on our third national security advisor in the White House, as you know, this position emerged in the modern presidential era as the curator and gatekeeper of our vast foreign policy network of analysis and expertise. The ideological bias of the current administration when it comes to religion further hampers the search for deeper understanding of religious dynamics. That bias consists of privileging one small religious community, fundamentalist white Christianity, at the expense of, say, understanding Islam, where the interests are only in kinetic solutions. But our diplomatic capacity is under a much broader assault, as can be seen from the radical purge of senior leaders and experts all across the State Department. Religion is not the only issue set that has suffered. It's the one that's most directly affected me, but to be honest, it's fairly far down the list in terms of the lack of expert capacity. When the president travels, he operates with the least amount of diplomatic expertise supporting him than any other president in the modern presidential era. Think about that. When he goes to Riyadh, he goes to Jerusalem, and he goes to Rome. On his first international trip, he had very precious little expertise on the religious dynamics of those three geographical locations with him. He sits across the table from international leaders with only marginal expertise advising him, if that much. It's a terrifying situation, and I'm growing increasingly fearful that 6 more years of this state of affairs may permanently damage America's standing in the world, to say nothing of our ability to shape and influence global affairs for the better. Now, it's not my intention to spoil today's discussions, but it needs to be said that the willingness of our diplomats to be consumers of expert analysis is being attacked on a daily systematic basis, and we may never see the day when something approaching normalcy returns. And this leads to my final question, and that is, can the pursuit of religious freedom by the current administration be a sufficient intellectual replacement of the type of work we did in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs and the type of analysis we find in today's papers? The short answer is no, it cannot. Religious freedom as practiced now is ideologically driven and frankly is not particularly interested in nuanced assessments of religious dynamics in Muslim countries. It is interested in promoting Christianity first and foremost, and is seen by that's seen by the anti-Islamic bona fides of so many of its senior political leaders. How can one proclaim religious freedom for all and simultaneously promote a Muslim ban with a straight face? That's appalling, chilling, and beyond belief, but that is in fact where we are with respect to religious dynamics. Now let me close on a somewhat less somber note. I'm in the process of reading Bill Burns' terrific new book, The Back Channel, a memoir of American diplomacy in the case for its renewal. We are, after all, in his house, and I want to tell you that it is a very powerful book, even though I'm not finished with it. I'm still reading as we speak. But its power is multivalent, and so far, I think its greatest trait for me is the portrait of what American diplomacy can once again be. And I should note that his portrait of Secretary Baker is quite compelling and quite fascinating, and that's worth the read on its own. It's a powerful antidote to the current assault on the American diplomatic institutions. He skillfully shows the limits as well as the potential for American diplomacy, and he's making an argument to try to return to that stance where making the world a better place and not being captive to narrow populist and anti-pluralist interests is in fact in America's interest. Buy the book, read it, digest it, and be inspired about the heights of what our diplomacy can accomplish once again. And don't give up the hard work of laboring to understand the infinitely complex study of religion and its implications for improving the state of the world. Thank you again to today's paper writers, and good luck with the rest of today's discussion. I think we do have time for a few questions. So. Yeah, just raise your hands and the microphone will come.
I'm Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. One of the things I found at State was our cultural secularity prevents us from making certain diplomatic approaches or implications. For example, I tried to include a Quranic verse in a white paper, and it was immediately expunged. I once suggested we demarche a major masjid that was causing some problems. Almost lost my head over that. This unwillingness of State to play the game on their fields rather than ours, to occasionally quote the Quran rather than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is killing us. What can you do about that?
Well, let me refer back to something Kadir said. You Google me, and I am a Christian by training, and I've discovered actually Google outside the boundaries of the United States, which is kind of interesting. So many times when I would met with religious leaders who were not Christian, they knew more about me than I knew about them. And part of my anxiety was, well, do I look like the American Christian guy who's there to sort of have a new form of crusade? And to my distinct pleasure, the overwhelming majority of international religious leaders were happy the State Department was sending somebody who had at least some sympathy and some understanding about religious dynamics around the world. I often, you would go in and eventually you want to get to good conversations by asking good questions and then shutting up and listening. But we have often had to go through phases at the beginning of a conversation where, particularly in the Islamic world, there was a lot of anger about bad American policy. I felt no need to defend that American policy. Now some of my State Department handlers were very upset when I said, yeah, that invasion thing in 2003 really was not a very good decision on their government's part. But people were stunned that affirming a huge part of America's problem in the Middle East stemmed from bad American foreign policy and bad military policy. So we tried to model. So I think when I got to the State Department, most people would recognize, as Secretary Kerry did, who had a deep intuition, we had missed a lot of diplomatic opportunities because we refused to engage with religious actors. We refused to assess religious dynamics and context. Our office tried to model both. How do you model engagement, and how do you bring a more sophisticated set of analytical lenses to these questions? So the resistance I met was not, should we be doing this work, which was quite interesting to me. I didn't encounter that kind of hardcore resistance. The tougher question is, how do you do this work? Because it can be done gloriously incorrectly. It can be highly counterproductive. So we had to think long and hard more on the how do you do this work question than should we do it. So in that sense, I think the question has now evolved, at least in the American intellectual context. It makes perfect sense to ask questions about religious authority in these countries. 15 years ago, it probably wouldn't have made sense intellectually, publicly, and within the bureaucracy. The much tougher question then is, how do you do this work of assessing religious dynamics and engaging religious actors? We modeled that. We commended that to embassies and posts, and that was one of our central missions. But my argument was always, that's going to be almost a generational thing. That if we convince the State Department to make it weave it into its DNA that every embassy has a religious landscape and they know the players and they understand the dynamics, our office could disappear. So we were there really on a training mission, and if in 20 years we had accomplished our work, then the Office of Religion and Global Affairs could disappear. Now, 3.5 years was not long enough to socialize those missions. Thank you. That was a great question.
My name is David Loudon. I'm a policy analyst. How do you go about examining and improving or setting policy that is based on the conditions of particular countries or regions without getting bogged down in the personalities that you have to deal with, so that it's not personality centric but based on the actual conditions?
Personalities in terms of in the American government, or personalities in the countries? Okay, all right. I was thinking about some personalities inside the building, but well, no. I mean, you obviously you have to pay attention to both. I mean, if you assess, if you had done all of these social scientific research questions and didn't ask about specific leaders and specific personalities, you'd be no substance to your work. So you have to deal with personalities as well as institutions. But if it's just about institutions or just about personalities, you really don't get the full texture, the complexity of how religion is lived in any country I'm aware of. Now, it is true, I read a lot of analysis in my almost 4 years in the State Department that focused exclusively on leaders. And I think that's a mistake. We often drew this distinction between engaging leaders and what we called lived religion. What does it mean to be a member of a particular religious community at a particular local level? And there were often huge gaps in our understanding between what national religious leaders were saying and what rank and file folk were doing. And many times, there were episodes where rank and file communities did stuff that their leaders were surprised by. So, but it's much easier to simply say, well, here are the 5 most important religious leaders in this country. Let's follow them and let's examine them, and our work here is done. The problem is that's an incomplete picture, and they many times are selling a particular interpretation of religion in their country that doesn't always map onto the lived reality. It's much harder to do the analysis of what's going at the grassroots level for 1,000 different reasons. But oftentimes that analysis, so this is where a scientific survey actually does provide you insights into what people are thinking at the grassroots level. So you have to do both. You can't ignore, you ignore one at great peril. So I think you have to do both. And then to make it more complicated, you have to look at mediating institutions between the grassroots and national leaders. So it's diabolically complex. And that's one of the reasons why I think diplomats are afraid to embrace this as a form of analysis, because it's bloody hard work. But thank you, that's a great question. Maybe time for one more?
In your capacity as the Director of Office of Religion and Global Affairs, how were you received over in the region, in your interactions with religious leaders, you or your office in general, or citizens of those countries? Do you have any examples that might shed some light into what kind of a role such an office or religion in general might play?
No, I think we were met almost universally with gratefulness that someone was showing up with at least a rudimentary understanding of what was happening in specific religious communities. They were not used to seeing American diplomats show up with that kind of interest and capacity. We weren't selling something to them in most occasions. One of the first things I realized when I had 2 realizations when I first came into the State Department. Number one is I knew a very tiny slice of global religion. And the notion of having 30 people, if there's 7 billion people on the planet, there are probably 70 billion forms of religious expression to be found. The notion that 30 people were going to understand global religious dynamics was absurd on the face of it. So, number one, I realized if we were going to be successful, we had to persuade the regional bureaus that our work and analysis would make them more successful in their strategic regional goals. So we had a team of regional advisors, each one assigned to one of the 6 regional bureaus, where we met with the assistant secretary and said, show us your strategic regional goals. We'll come back with a plan of how our analysis can help you be successful in pursuing your goals. That then opened doors for us in those regions when people in the regional bureaus would call us in and say, we got a problem here, we've got an interesting thing going over there. Can you come in and help us understand what's going on? The other piece of it was, and Peter Mandeville here can confirm or contradict what I'm going to say, we had as deep an analytical grasp of dynamics in the Islamic world of any office in the executive branch outside the intelligence community. And that's, I hired people who knew what I didn't know. I'm by no means an expert in that part of the world. And I can't even fake it with any kind of competency. So we developed a capacity that opened up doors for us around the world. There were times we would travel, or people in our staff would travel, and we'd get meetings with country leaders that the ambassador himself or herself could not get on their own, because we were there with a level of sophisticated understanding of religious dynamics. So, I mean, certainly there were doors that were slammed in our face, but on the other hand, I think we got access to a lot of conversation partners around the world that no one else in the U.S. government was able to do. Well, thank you very much. I think time is of the essence, and I don't want to backstop the rest of today's conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Again, congratulations on your work product.
Well, no, I'm not agreeing with you, but I'm just making sure everybody's ready. Good morning. To my great surprise, at least, we're actually running slightly ahead of schedule. My name is Nathan Brown. I'm at George Washington University, but also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment. You can forget those facts now, because my primary job here is to introduce our three speakers. We do have some rich material. I shouldn't say we. They have some rich material to present. I had a peek at the papers earlier, and they're very much worthy of your attention. We do have a very tight schedule, so that rather than interrupting the panel periodically with fulsome introductions, I'm going to give you very quick introductions of each speaker and then hand it over to them. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes or so, and that should leave some time for question and answer. And my main goal is to make sure that I keep us on schedule, since everybody else has been so good with schedules so far. So the three speakers, the first one is Courtney Freer. She got her master's at George Washington University, and before that she got degrees at Princeton and Oxford and places like that. She did a PhD actually there, and is currently a research fellow at London School of Economics, works primarily on the Gulf. The second speaker is Anel Shiline, who is also got her PhD at George Washington University, but she also is currently Zwan Fellow at the Baker Institute down in Houston, and she has remarkably broad expertise throughout the Middle East. The third speaker has had no association with George Washington University that I know of, but this is not his first time at the Carnegie Endowment. He was actually a junior fellow here some years ago. He retired out to California, where he's doing a PhD at a place called Stanford University. But Scott Williamson has done some fascinating research in Jordan, and he's here to present it to us. So let me just first hand it over to Courtney. Take it from there.
Great, thanks so much. It's great to be back in DC, and I think it's great to start with the Gulf, and specifically with the two Wahhabi states we have in the Middle East, which are of course Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So Wahhabism, I think, is a central element we've had on debates about different strands of Islam and religious extremism, especially in terms of educational institutions, both within and funded by countries of the Arabian Peninsula. The structures linked to Wahhabism, which of course is one of the most conservative strands of Islam, are perhaps the opacest in the Middle East, which has led to, I think, considerable misconceptions about the religious ideology, its practice, as well as figures linked to it. So the practice of Wahhabism, furthermore, in Saudi Arabia at least, appears to be changing under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So while traditionally the strictures of Wahhabism have influenced everyday life in the kingdom and have been enforced by religious police, this arrangement appears to be changing, with restrictions on gender segregation and entertainment recently having been at least partially lifted, and with the institutionalized clergy and police force increasingly separate from the mechanisms of central political power. The underlying, and whereas in Qatar we have much less institutionalized links between the clergy and the state. The underlying questions I wanted to address here were basically, first of all, are these Wahhabi states qualitatively different in terms of which religious authorities are followed there? And secondly, is there one type of Wahhabism that exists among these two states which seem relatively similar, at least at first glance? So by way of introduction, I suppose, Wahhabism is of course linked to Salafism in terms of its emphasis on a return to what's considered the original sources of Islam and the Hanbali school of jurisprudence. Unlike Salafism, however, Wahhabism has its origins in the work of 18th century theologian Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who preached in the central Arabian region of the Najd, and at that time forged a relationship with the Al Saud family. And it's from that period that this relationship between the Al Saud, and specifically the Al Sheikh family, as religious scholars developed, and that led to the institutionalization of religious authority as we see it in Saudi Arabia. Although Qatar, of course, is also officially Wahhabi, the religious sphere is not similarly bureaucratized. There's no institutionalized state religious authority in the form of, for instance, a Grand Mufti or even a bureaucratized state ulama. And in fact, most religious authorities in Qatar are not Qatari. And so we don't see this indigenous state-linked ulama in the same way as we have in Saudi Arabia. So in terms of the region-wide survey, which was done in December 2017, we saw some key insights on the influence of Wahhabism. And I think the main takeaway that I found among both countries is that religious figures linked to the state are most likely to be trusted, which is something Kadir alluded to. So figures from the bureaucratized ulama in Saudi Arabia and figures linked to the Ministry of Awqaf and to the judiciary in Qatar were seen as more influential or more trusted than independent religious figures. So in terms of the Saudi data, we had 2,010 people in the data set, about half of whom were Saudis and the other half of whom were mostly Arab expatriates. 60% were men, 79% had university degrees, over half of them lived in Riyadh and Jeddah, and 87% of them was Sunni. So we had a slightly skewed sample in terms of Sunni men based in cities and well-educated as well. Nonetheless, the three most trusted scholars in Saudi Arabia, among nearly an equal number of nationals and non-nationals, were all from the Council of Senior Scholars, which is appointed by the king and is the only body permitted to grant religious rulings in the state. So the number one most trusted figure was Sheikh Saad bin Nasser al-Shatri, who is a member of this council and also an advisor to Mohammed bin Salman. The second most trusted was the Grand Mufti, and the third most trusted was also from al-Sheikh family and from the Council of Supreme Scholars. Meanwhile, in the Qatari case, we had a much smaller sample size of 245 people, 7 of whom were Qataris. 90% of the sample was Sunni, 68% was men, 85% were Arab expats, and 82% were university educated, as well as 93% living in Doha. So again, we see the skew towards Sunni, well-educated men in the city. Nonetheless, we saw that the most trusted figures were again linked to the state. The most trusted overall was Wahhabi Sheikh Anwar al-Badawi, who's an Qatari Islamic judge and head of the Qatari Islamic Judges. The second most trusted was also a Qatari Wahhabi scholar, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayd al-Mahmoud, who had a major role in putting together the judicial system of Qatar and is now a part of the Islamic Cultural Center in Qatar. So not strictly linked to the state at this point, but still has had a role in the judiciary there. Interestingly, the third most trusted figure was Tariq Ramadan, who is the European-based scholar and grandson of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I don't know whether, if we redid this survey since his recent legal troubles, that would be different. But it is interesting that there's more variety in the Qatari case in terms of which religious authorities are followed, reflecting the fact that the state is less, the state institutionalizes religious authority less so than the Saudi state. And I think this also may be explained by demographics. Qatar is 87% expatriate, whereas Saudi Arabia is 27% expatriate. Nonetheless, I think it's interesting that in the Saudi case, where we had a near equal number of citizens and non-citizens, we saw relatively similar viewpoints in terms of trusting religious authorities linked to the state. We also, I think as Kadir alluded to, saw how much people trusted 7 main religious authorities: Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's Doha-based and has been linked to the Brotherhood in the past, Baghdadi from ISIS, Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed al-Tayyib, Egyptian preacher Amr Khalid, President Erdogan from Turkey, and Rashid Ghanouchi. Yes, is that 7? But anyway, and so what we found was overall is that the least trusted figures were actually Nasrallah and Baghdadi. We saw different results in terms of the endorsement effects, where there was slightly more support for Baghdadi, but overall in both Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Baghdadi and Nasrallah were seen as the least trusted. There was also very low levels of trust in Saudi Arabia for any of these international figures, which is interesting. In Qatar, there was only really marginal trust for Sheikh Qaradawi of all of those figures. So in terms of kind of what this tells us for policymakers, I think there are 4 main takeaways. First, when it comes to influencing messaging on citizen and non-citizen populations in the Gulf, it's important to engage with state religious authorities since they hold considerable sway in the religious sector and in society more broadly. It's also essential to understand their limitations, however, since their authority is by no means absolute, and I think this is most clearly evidenced in Saudi Arabia by the rise of the Sahwa movement in the 1990s, and more recently in 2011, when we saw clerics linked to the Sahwa movement sign a petition urging for some political reforms. Further, state-linked authorities who were once considered more widely influential across borders no longer wield the influence they once did, which I think is most clearly influenced by the overwhelmingly negative endorsement effect we saw regarding the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Indeed, what we saw is that when the religious statement that it had less support when it had been endorsed by the Imam of Al-Azhar, which I think is a surprising outcome. As a result, I'd say that engagement with local ministries of Awqaf is perhaps the most important means of ensuring that messaging about religion is diffused in a manner that resonates with local populations of both expatriates and nationals. So the roles of ministry remains very much crucial. Second, levers of social and political change in terms of the public practice of Islam and the state's role in regulating it are not likely to be economic in the wealthy countries of the Arabian Peninsula. Because governments of these states benefit, of course, from hydrocarbon wealth, they're able to provide handsomely for their citizenry in terms of free education, healthcare, and handsomely paying public sector jobs. As a result, groups that provide materials for their followers don't have an advantage over other groups, as we have seen with the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, in places like Egypt and Jordan in the past. And in fact, when we look at where people get religious support in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, it's overwhelmingly from the state. So among Saudi nationals, 12.9% reported they had received assistance from a state religious agency versus 4.5% who got support from the Muslim Brotherhood, 2.9% from Salafis, and 1.8% from Sufis. The results were similar among non-nationals, even though they may have marginally less access to state resources. 8.2% had received assistance from a government religious authority or organization compared to 5.4% from the Brotherhood, 4% from Salafis, and 1.5% from Sufi groups. In Qatar, only 8% in total had sought aid from any government religious agency, followed by 5.7% from the Brotherhood and 3% from Salafis, again demonstrating that the government is a primary dispenser of religious aid, both to national and non-national populations. As is expected then, overall there's little need or at least little use made of religious groups for material support in these environments. So for religious organizations to hold influence in these types of environment, they really need to have an ideological appeal or a specific social function, since they can't really benefit from providing materially. Third, which is something I've alluded to, expatriates follow and are influenced by local religious authorities to a larger extent than we may realize or than I, quite frankly, expected. The fact that most of the trusted religious authorities in both countries were state-affiliated reflects either their appeal or the ubiquity of state-sanctioned religious messaging in these Wahhabi environments. What's also interesting is how the influence of state-affiliated Wahhabi religious leaders may undermine the sway of kind of what we would consider mainstream Islamist leaders who hold sway elsewhere in the region. So for instance, figures like Rashid Ghannouchi and Erdogan had very negative endorsement effects among nationals and expatriate populations in Saudi Arabia, suggesting that political Islam, especially of the type linked to the Brotherhood, is unfavorable. In Qatar, we saw similarly strong negative endorsement effects for the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which I mentioned, as well as for President Erdogan, which I found surprising. These results demonstrate the extent to which expats also seem to be swayed by local religious authorities and the degree to which Islamist leaders or leaders of Islamic authorities like Al-Azhar don't really hold as much influence across borders as we may have expected. On a related note, the strong negative endorsement effect we saw of religious leaders linked to the Muslim Brotherhood or more broadly to these mainstream Islamist movements may reflect some Gulf governments, especially Saudi, efforts to depoliticize Islam in a way that enables them to strengthen their control over local populations for whom Brotherhood leaders may have once held appeal. And I think this dynamic could lead to greater support or visibility for Salafi and Wahhabi figures instead, or general weakening in broader terms of appeal to politically engaged, the appeal of politically engaged Islamic groups. Fourth, and finally, the practice and regulation of Wahhabism varies based on the socioeconomic and political environment, which is something Kadir also highlighted. And I think this is surprising because we see how flexible Wahhabism is despite the rigidity of its doctrine. As a result, a single strategy to engage with Wahhabism across different countries will likely be unsuccessful, even though places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia seem very similar at first glance. So political and social context matters, despite similarities in religious practice or doctrine. Neither state also obviously allows much opportunity for meaningful political reform, yet Saudi Arabia, as I referred to, more stringently and officially enforces the strictures of Wahhabism and it institutionalizes the religious sphere. By contrast, in Qatar, we see a largely foreign class of ulama, which is important because this also means that if these people do not kind of hew closely to the state line, they can be deported very easily. Nonetheless, we don't see as institutionalized a relationship between the state and religious authorities or really public enforcement of the social tenets of Wahhabism. So just by way of concluding, I think the divergent religious structures and authorities in the two Wahhabi states of Qatar and Saudi Arabia reveal a number of common threads in both countries, such as I mentioned, the enduring strength of state-linked religious authorities, the limit of support for Islamist political and social movements, and the extent to which expats appear to reflect their local religious environments. Saudi Arabia, as I've mentioned, is of course unique in the extent to which the religious sector is bureaucratized, which leaves little space for independent religious activity or the support of non-state linked figures. The clear cooptation of the religious sphere, which is illustrated most clearly by the state's employ of clergy, has neutralized the ability of this sphere to challenge the state. or state views on religious practice, in so doing tying the specific religious ideology to both the state and its legitimacy. Nonetheless, the fact that preachers have traditionally been employees of the state with the exclusive power to release religious rulings, independent clerics like Salman al-Oda and independent movements like Sahwa movement have emerged. And since the rise of Mohammed bin Salman to power, we see both state and independent clerics losing power inside of Saudi Arabia. So the religious police, for instance, no longer has the power to arrest. Social functions like concerts and the opening of cinemas are going forward despite some contestation from members of the Wahhabi ulama. And several independent clerics and activists were imprisoned as of September 2017. Mohammed bin Salman himself, in a famous interview last year with The Atlantic, went so far as to question the existence of Wahhabism itself. In his words, "No one can define Wahhabism. There is no Wahhabism. We don't believe we have Wahhabism." Clearly, a reconfiguration then is underway in Saudi Arabia in terms of the relationship between the state and religious authorities, with central political leadership eager to demonstrate its dominance over the religious sphere. Meanwhile, in Qatar, notwithstanding efforts to educate an indigenous clergy, the relationship between state and religion remains largely unchanged. Interestingly, Qatar did kind of reassert its place as a Wahhabi state in 2017 by naming its state mosque Sheikh Mohammed ibn al-Wahhab, something which provoked a lot of outrage inside of Saudi Arabia and actually led to a letter circulated by 200 members of the ulama proclaiming that Qatar was not properly Wahhabi and that the Al Thani family had no relationship to al-Wahhab. So this demonstrates the extent to which links to the cleric and links to kind of Wahhabism as a proper ideology is important for religious legitimacy of these states, despite the fact that things seem to be changing. So I think by way of closing, the Arab world's two Wahhabi states really are not too exceptional because of the strict form of Islam embraced in these states. Rather, it's the context that matters. And so we see this in terms of the specific social, political, and economic formations of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And so given the results of the survey, I stressed the importance of engagement with official religious authorities and the inclusion of expatriate populations in discussions about religious trends in the Wahhabi states of Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Very much. No?
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here, especially after, as Sean said, this is not particularly important to the current DC establishment, so appreciate that you're here anyway to hear what we have to say. Because I think, as probably many of you are aware, and as the results of the survey show, these religious leaders do matter in this context. So even if inside the Beltway we've decided this is maybe less of a priority, clearly this does really matter in the regions that we're discussing. So I did the report on Morocco, so I'll be talking about 3 main findings, and then in the Q&A, if you have questions about other aspects, I'm happy to discuss that as well. First of all, as Kadir had pointed out, state religious figures do have more authority than what has commonly been assumed. The assumption has tended to be that if an official is affiliated with the state, it will reduce their credibility because it's typically affiliated with an authoritarian regime. And so what we found in Morocco, and largely across the board, is that actually official religious figures do have more credibility than we might have otherwise assumed. In Morocco, this is especially striking because the king of Morocco, Mohammed al-Sadis, or Mohammed VI, is the figure in Morocco with the highest religious authority, which might be somewhat surprising, as I will get into shortly. So that'll be the first takeaway, which is King Mohammed VI has above and beyond the highest religious authority of Moroccan religious figures. The second interesting finding is that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State, is the figure that has perhaps the second highest religious authority in Morocco. This finding, as I will get into greater detail, but just to explain, this finding was not revealed through direct questions. If someone was directly asked about al-Baghdadi, people would not say they considered him a figure that should be looked to answer questions on religion. But in using the survey experiment, using an endorsement effect, when people were asked, when a statement was attributed to al-Baghdadi, people were far more likely to agree with it than if the statement was unattributed or if it was attributed to another person. So we'll get into a little bit more of the implications of that. The third finding is that although historically Morocco has a lot of different competing figures for religious authority, Morocco historically was a sort of a center of religious learning during the Islamic Golden Age. In the contemporary period, we have active Islamist groups, some of which are legally engaged in the democratic process, some of which are banned. So the king competes with other sort of existing points of religious authority. However, at present, the king is not facing much competition. This is partly the result of efforts by the king to sort of reduce competition, as well as just some generational shift in leadership of some of these groups. So I'll get into all three of those points in greater detail, and then we'll talk about some implications for US foreign policy, if anybody's listening, or given maybe for the future. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the King Mohammed VI's religious authority is it is grounded in a very concerted effort by the Moroccan state to construct this religious authority. I think Sean's point about how religious authority can be made, it can be broken, it can be manufactured, it can be stolen is very important to keep in mind. And so the Moroccan state has heavily invested in a nation-building project that holds up the figure of the king as the commander of the faithful, as Amir al-Mu'minin. And this is significant. This does have historical precedent. However, it is best understood as the result of a contemporary and a modern state-building and nation-building process, and is not because every Moroccan sort of has this sense of, oh, the Amir al-Mu'minin has this religious authority. No, this is very much the result of nation-building and concerted efforts through education, through the discourse that is disseminated through mosques. So a little bit of history about the figure of the commander of the faithful. As again, Sean's point about, it's important to consult the historians to bring more context into this, I think in the Moroccan case is especially important. So at the time that the French colonized Morocco during the Moroccan protectorate of the early 20th century, the figure of the commander of the faithful had lost a lot of political clout. Although it was the same ruling family that is currently ruling Morocco, has ruled since the 1600s. At the time, they were seen as essentially puppets of the French. They'd lost a lot of credibility, and the assumption among a lot of Moroccan nationalists was, as the result, or once the Moroccan national movement was successful and Morocco was established, the figure of Amir al-Mu'minin would not be part of the new Moroccan independent republic. That had no place in sort of a modern Arab republic, as we ended up observing with the abolishment of the monarchy in Egypt, for example, in Iraq. However, Mohammed V, who's the grandfather of the current king, managed to survive, partly based on divisions within the national movement. He became something of a national figure, and so survived the transition, was able to retain his position as head of state. His son then codified the position of the commander of the faithful in the 1962 constitution, and then his son, the current king, inherited that sort of religious authority. However, Morocco, as I said, has a history of many different sort of poles of religious authority, many of which are based in Fez, a historic center of Islamic learning. And so the current Moroccan state worked very hard to dismantle those existing sources of religious authority, the existing religious institutions, such that now the figure of the Amir al-Mu'minin actually is probably more powerful. He has the weight of the modern state behind him, and the current Moroccan population has been subjected to decades of nation building that sort of center religious authority in him. So all that to say that when people attribute religious authority to the King of Morocco, I think that the findings of this survey that demonstrate this are valid. However, it is best understood as a result of a construction of religious authority. The second finding, having to do with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, as Kadir pointed out, the findings having to do with high support for, or high agreement with statements affiliated with al-Baghdadi, we tended to see that result in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Jordan, and in Saudi Arabia, the four contexts that were the highest senders of foreign fighters to fight for Daesh or the Islamic State. And it's sort of a question, so we don't have exact numbers on was there an overlap between kind of who saw the king as a religious figure or a source of religious authority, and who saw Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We don't have those exact numbers because, again, it was a survey experiment. However, based on the relatively high numbers, it seems there is some overlap, or it'd be possible to assume that. And so the way to sort of understand how someone could see both King Mohammed VI as a figure of religious authority and the leader of the Islamic State, I would attribute, at least partially, to a lot of anti-Shia rhetoric that the Moroccan state has been engaged in. There are almost no Shia in Morocco, but there's a lot of paranoia about Iranian influence. And so a lot of official religious discourse, a lot of religious messaging in Moroccan media have heightened a lot of concern about Shia. And so when the Islamic State also engaged in a lot of this rhetoric, arguing that, you know, the Bashar al-Assad regime that they would call Shia were attacking, you know, poor Sunni families in Syria, and that, you know, the ruling Shia in Iraq were also attacking poor Sunnis in Iraq. I think that probably contributed to some sense of needing to go and protect Sunni brethren in that part of the world, and that this was a population that was already primed to have a lot of concern about the threat of sort of Shia aggression. The third major point having to do with the lack of other religious figures in Morocco. So we asked about, for example, the current prime minister, Saadetdine Othmani, who had very little trust or approval. We also asked about the current head of the group Al-Adl wa Ihsan, which is a banned Islamist group that was previously seen as a massive Islamist movement in Morocco. It rejects the authority of the king. It was very much seen as a threat to the previous king. However, the very charismatic founder died, and the current leader has not yet managed to necessarily articulate where the group is going. He's not particularly well known based on what we found in the results. Relatedly, for the PJD, the ruling Islamist party, they were seen as sort of a success story to some extent to come out of 2011, that as a result of reforms that were implemented following massive protests in Morocco, the PJD was able to lead a coalition government starting in 2012, and they were reelected, or they got a plurality of votes in the 2016 parliamentary election. However, it's possible that the previous prime minister, Abdelillah Ben Kiraan, was seen as potentially a threat to the king. He was popular, he won a second election. It's possible that the king and the mahzen, the elites, the political elites in Morocco, worked to make sure that Ben Kiraan was unable to reform a new coalition government. And so after months of stasis and, you know, no movement to actually build a new government, the king appointed the Secretary General of the PJD, Saadetdine Othmani, to take over, sort of sidelining Ben Kiraan. However, Othmani lacks the leadership, the charisma that Ben Kiraan had, and so there's also questions of kind of what's the future of the PJD, given that the king and the ruling elites have essentially sort of defanged them for now. Two other interesting figures are Salafists, one previously affiliated or associated with the 2003 Casablanca bombing, so a Salafi jihadist, someone who had previously been engaged in sort of violent rhetoric, who was subsequently has moderated his tone, was let out of jail. The other figure is a Salafi cleric who is not religious, is not violent, has not embraced any sort of violent rhetoric, but has said things like Wahhabi Islam is preferable to Moroccan Islam, for example, sees Saudi Arabia as more of a figure of religious authority than Morocco. However, neither of these figures, although they previously were relatively seen as relatively high profile, not seen as sort of significant religious figures in Morocco. So I'm happy to talk more about any kind of specifics if there's any Morocco files who want to dig into the details, but I'll spare the rest of you any more details on Morocco. But I think the final takeaway should be caution on the part of the US foreign policy establishment in trying to partner with Morocco, because Morocco's whole narrative is based on this notion of heritage, that the figure of the Amir al-Mu'minin is deeply grounded in Moroccan culture. This, the narrative is that this is a very long-standing figure of religious authority, such that partnering with the United States too overtly could actually undermine the religious authority of the king. When I was in Morocco in 2016 and spoke with US embassy officials, they were abundantly aware of this. However, it's unclear if current officials have that same level of awareness of the extent to which affiliation with the US can produce sort of an allergic reaction among locals who are very sensitive to this perceived foreign pressure to encourage so-called moderate Islam. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Anel. Thank you. Scott?
Thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Carnegie and the Baker Institute for hosting us. As Nathan mentioned, I was a former junior fellow here, so I'm very honored to be back. It's great to be here. So just for some context, I spent most of last year in Jordan doing research for my dissertation. In addition to this survey, worked on some other survey work, archival work, and did over 100 interviews, about which 25 addressed the contents in this report. So I'll start where the report starts, with King Abdullah's very well-polished discussion paper on his vision for Jordan as a civil state, which I believe was his 6th discussion paper since the Arab Spring. And in it, he makes the point, because he's very cognizant of the fact that the term civil state has some controversy in the Muslim world, that religion will always be an important part of Jordan's value system, that it's in the constitution. But he's also careful to give a sort of warning that religion should not be used for political purposes by partisan actors. And this is a very common framing in the region, where state actors and regimes try to frame the appropriate use of religion in this way. And it reflects an attempt to leverage religion to reinforce support for the status quo by folding religious institutions into the state, and a chance to define the Islamist parties that reflect their primary opposition as outside the bounds of acceptable religious discourse. And as Anel mentioned, and as Nathan and Anel and others have talked about in other work, it's sort of unclear how well this strategy should be expected to work in many countries. Public trust tends to be low in institutions across the region, and frankly, for good reason. And it's not hard to see how, when it comes to matters of religion specifically, people might have trouble trusting religious leaders who seem to be dependent on corrupt and untrustworthy authoritarian regimes. Since we typically associate credibility with independence, it would be somewhat surprising to see that these institutions seem to have credible authority in the eyes of the people. And in part for that reason, a lot of scholarly work, think tank work, policy work, has focused on issues surrounding Islamist parties and movements, which are also very important, but there's probably been a little less of this focus on state religious leaders. So what we have seen in the findings mentioned so far by the others, and was also the case in Jordan, is actually that this isn't necessarily the case, and that state religious leaders do seem to have a decent amount of trust in their authority amongst the public. If you look through the Jordan results, you will see that Islamist and Salafi leaders we selected were trusted by almost no one who said that they already knew about them. And interestingly, they were unknown to a majority of respondents in all 3 cases, whether it was the Secretary General of the Islamic Action Front or prominent Salafi and Jihadi Salafi clerics. So that's not a particularly encouraging picture if you are affiliated with those movements. On the other hand, the state religious leader we asked about, the Grand Mufti of Jordan, was known by about 75% of respondents, and most of those expressed some level of trust in his authority as a religious figure. In a separate survey that I implemented on my own, also with YouGov, I asked respondents about the Aman message, which was propagated by the king and senior state religious leaders in 2004. And this was an attempt to define a tolerant, moderate form of Jordanian Islam, both in the country but also globally, involving several hundred international religious. Talking to scholars in Jordan, there's a lot of skepticism that this message has any resonance with the public. That the regime uses this was surprised by how many Jordanians in my sample said that they had heard of the message previously. When I gave a description of what it entailed, which did not mention the king to try and avoid. I was also surprised that 2/3 of people said that the message represents Islam and speaks for them as a Muslim, and approximately 80% said that. Taken together, I think these findings paint a picture in which Islamists are perceived of Jordanian society, while state religious officials possess relatively greater authority, although as I note in the report, it still appears to be fairly fragile. Then try and situate these findings in the context of more general Jordanian attitudes towards religion, politics in the state, and the relationship between using the polling data in our survey and also from the Arab Barometer, which runs regular nationally representative Jordan and other countries in the region. What those results show is, probably unsurprisingly to anyone, highly religiously observant, and they also strongly endorse some role for Sharia in the country's constitution. But at the same time, there does appear to be a fairly strong public consensus against any mixing of religion with partisan politics. For instance, Jordanians really don't want religious officials or mosques influencing voters' choices in elections. And this seems to align with our findings about religious authority that I just went over, because state religious officials do portray themselves as apolitical religious bureaucrats and scholars and judges, as opposed to Islamists that tend to be more openly political. And so just briefly, I want to transition back to our region-wide data. In case some of you are not convinced by these questions where we ask about specific religious leaders or you're worried about people falsifying their preferences, we also implemented something called a conjoint experiment in the survey. We have a rough draft of a more academic paper that we're hoping to publish soon, at least in academic terms, which tries to evaluate the different factors that contribute to perceptions of more or less religious authority. And so the basic idea here is that we create randomly generated profiles of hypothetical religious leaders defined by different characteristics that we've pre-selected. And we then ask survey respondents to compare different profiles and choose the one that they think they would trust more in matters of religion. And because these characteristics are randomly assigned, it gives us some leverage in terms of figuring out which of these characteristics are driving respondents' choices and by how much. So we did this several times for all 12,000 respondents who were Sunni and Muslim in the different countries, and it reinforces the findings that come out in many of these reports, which is that respondents in almost every country seem to prefer characteristics associated with state religious leaders. They tended to exhibit less trust in Islamists and Salafis. And they did penalize religious leaders and viewed them as less authoritative when they were described as being openly involved in politics, whether that was supporting or criticizing the government, meeting with the US embassy, or advocating for armed resistance against the US, and other such things. So going back to Jordan, what are the implications for these findings? In terms of state religious leaders, the pattern suggests that, in fact, the government can lean on their authority to bolster support for some of its policies in some cases. And there are clear examples here, some of which I reference in the report. So for instance, according to former government officials and women's rights activists I met with in Jordan, who are not affiliated with these institutions, they do see state religious leaders as playing an important role in promoting policies designed to increase contraceptive use, for instance, and also contributing to the repeal of Article 308 a few years ago, which had allowed rapists to escape punishment if they married their victims. Nathan and his co-authors have also written about how the Sharia courts played an important role in pushing reforms to Jordan's personal status law, and they did that by bringing together different groups within the society and convincing them that this was the right way forward. However, our findings also highlight the extent to which there are risks for the government in overtly politicizing their state religious institutions. When Jordanians show this dislike for politicized religious figures, that doesn't just apply to Islamists, but it should also extend to religious figures affiliated with the government if they come to be viewed as functionaries for whatever the government wants them to say. So traditionally, Jordan has exercised less control over its religious sphere than some of the other governments in the region, which may partially explain our findings about credibility. But in recent years, that has changed somewhat, and they've increased their control over religious leaders, doing more to dictate what imams say in Friday sermons, and increasingly banning those who stray from the scripts. These moves follow the rise of ISIS, and the government claims both privately and publicly that they're justified by trying to fight extremism and cracking down on rhetoric that supports these groups. The problem, though, at least as I see it, is that taking these steps may undermine the credibility of state officials at the precise moment in which their authority is most valuable. If Jordanians increasingly come to see these religious leaders as politicized government functionaries rather than apolitical bureaucrats and scholars, their ability to counter extremist ideas will likely be undermined further. And to just illustrate how this increased control might affect credibility, I want to highlight one quote from the report in which I was talking to a Jordanian activist and scholar, and he sort of scoffed and said, preachers now talk about respecting parents because they can't talk about anything sensitive. And the implication there is that what they're saying seems to be filtered and stale and sort of irrelevant to Jordanians' lives because they cannot stray from what they've been told to talk about, and so people just don't care as much. So that's obviously not to say that Jordanian officials should stop trying to crack down on extremism, but trying to control the words that come out of religious leaders' mouths is probably not the right way to do it. A reactive strategy is probably more useful where you're monitoring speech and identifying those who call for violence or cross other legal red lines while investing in better training and salaries for the religious sphere. But in general, I would say trying to encourage the credibility of these officials by giving them independence is the best way forward. And this suggestion, I think, also has implications for US counter-extremism policy in Jordan. So let's not forget that endorsing free speech on religious matters is about as American a value as you can have. But if we set that aside and assume that policymakers don't really care about that, they should still be encouraging the Jordanian government to relax restrictions on those religious officials who give Friday sermons and have other interactions with the public. Even if that means more rhetoric, on average, that Jordanian and US officials don't like, hopefully that increased credibility would, at least in the long run, provide one of the most effective antidotes to the spread of extremist ideas in the country. And then also just going back to the idea that state religious officials can be effective at influencing social policies and public opinion on social policies. For any US officials in the country who work on issues like women's rights or public health, it does suggest that building partnerships with these officials and engaging with them regularly in dialogue would be quite fruitful. So just briefly to wrap up, I'll discuss implications for Islamist movements in Jordan, which will be the focus of more of the next panel. And the results suggest that Islamists may be caught in somewhat of a bind here. Their religious activism is the core message that attracts their political supporters. But the fact that most Jordanians seem to dislike politicized religion suggests a relatively low ceiling on their potential support. If they leave religion behind, perhaps they will alienate their core supporters. On the other hand, if they stick to this approach, they may never be able to move past a certain level of support. The Muslim Brotherhood and its political affiliate, the Islamic Action Front, has struggled since the Arab Spring. A lot of that has to do with government repression, which has contributed to internal divisions. And it did perform relatively well in the 2016 parliamentary elections, but it still has very limited political influence. But what's interesting about those elections is that the movement actually did try to position itself in a less religious way. It dropped several religious references, it emphasized national identity, it aligned with Christian candidates, and took other steps as well. And so it does appear that the movement is trying to follow the path of similar movements in Morocco and Tunisia by downplaying its religious roots significantly, and it will be interesting to see how that affects their support going forward. So I'll stop there. Thanks again. Looking forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. Actually, thank you very much, all three, for a really interesting set of presentations. Let me just give a very few brief framing remarks and then throw it open for questions. I mean, we've heard three very data-rich papers about 4 different cases: Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Jordan. And so we've, in a sense, been very much down in the weeds, but I hear some very, very strong themes, commonalities coming out of these that are sometimes sort of modestly pushed, but it still come through, I think, very, very strongly. Number one is just the importance of national context. That comes through very clearly in all presentations. Second is the tremendous presence of the state in the religious realm. Again, that's almost a given for the research that was done. A third thing that to me was very interesting is this is going to be complicated. Sean Casey made some reference to how authority is almost impossible to define in the religious realm, but let me just throw out two quick different definitions because the papers are grappling with both. Authority in the sense of political authority, be able to say that's the official answer. You get a job, you don't get a job. We will teach that, we won't teach that. But there's also authority in the sense of moral authority, that is credibility, whether people believe you're giving the right answer to the question. And one interesting thing that I hear is the complex relationship between the two, the moral authority and political authority, not an inverse relationship in any of these countries, or not absolutely an inverse relationship, but a complex relationship between the ability to sort of speak with the state authority and the ability to be heard, to be given the right answers. There's a complex dynamic in all four cases. And finally, to me, what is very interesting is that the title of the conference is Implications for U.S. Policy, but in a sense, that was not at the center of any of the presentations. They might sort of dip a foot into that. And to me, there's actually a very strong argument, implicit argument, which I'm going to try and make explicit, but I think that is uniting these presentations. And again, it goes back to some things that Sean Casey mentioned in his a morning keynote. And I do remember actually being in discussions in this building about 15 years ago when there was the beginnings of a very, very strong effort to kind of grapple with the realities of Islam in the Middle East and broader in the Muslim world. And a lot of the implicit questions was, who are the right Muslims? Right? Are they Sufis? Because they're peaceful. Maybe we need to align with Sufis and support Sufis. Maybe we need to support LS. Maybe we need to support this group, that group. What do we do with Islamists and so forth and so on? So it was a who question that was dominating the debate, and kind of who is it that we talk to, who is it that we support? And I am going to suggest that we're hearing an implicit argument about U.S. policy, that it makes sense. The who question may or may not be a good one, but it's not the first question to ask. The first question is kind of what's going on the ground, and what are the relevant actors, and what is their relationship, what is their credibility. So we're starting with social and political analysis that is very, very deeply locally grounded before we rush into asking about exactly who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and maybe that's not even the best question to be asking. So I hear that as an implicit argument, and that so there would be very clear implications for U.S. policy, that if this kind of analysis is relevant, that's how to make use of it. So that's at least what I heard and what I read into some of their comments. Let me now open it up for questions. I see in the very back. Let me start in the very back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Can you say something in the Saudi case about what MBS claims is a newly tolerant discourse of Islam as the official establishment version of that in Saudi Arabia, of the Muslim World League, Sheikh Al-Isa taking a new position on various issues of tolerance, national identity, and so on. Is this credible? Is it having some effects? Is it too soon to tell? What should we make of all of that? Thank you.
Courtney, why don't you take that? And Adele's just back from Saudi Arabia. If you have any thoughts, you're welcome to share them. But if they're not sorted out yet, then you're welcome to reserve them for later.
Well, I think really what MBS and I think MBZ in the UAE also are trying to market is this idea of moderate Islam. And I think that essentially, I mean, it implies that Islam on its own is immoderate, which is problematic from the start, but it also is this idea, I think, that politics and religion should be separated. And so I think we're seeing that in terms of kind of giving the religious clergy less power politically. I don't know whether or to what extent this can kind of change long term, given the institutionalization of the religious authorities inside of Saudi Arabia. What's interesting is that the Supreme Council or the Supreme Council of Ulama so far have kind of backed MBS for the most part. And so I don't know whether that will change in the future if he pushes kind of too far. But I think we also see kind of him turning to two audiences. So on the one hand, allowing women to drive, and then on the other hand, arresting female activists, which was popular among kind of some of the more religious, more conservative elements inside of Saudi Arabia. So he's kind of trying to balance these two audiences. So overall, I think it's this idea of depoliticizing Islam, which is important, I think, for him in terms of socially, economically, also kind of trying to start tourism in Saudi Arabia, but also, of course, politically, this idea that the Sahwa movement is no longer able really to operate whatsoever, and that was a potential political competitor. But in terms of the long-term implications, I think it's really hard to know to what extent this will stick and whether there will be a turning point at which the ulama no longer support him.
Maybe just to add, Courtney is more of an expert on this, but I just got back from Saudi Arabia and actually did meet with the new head of the Muslim World League, Mohammed al-Isa. And I think in general, the takeaway I got from Saudi Arabia is the Saudi state is trying to walk a very careful line right now in which they are putting forward a lot of policies, a lot of PR around the idea that Saudi is transforming. However, they really want to frame it as a social transformation, because to frame it as a fundamentally religious transformation risks damaging the source of Saudi, both religious credibility abroad and sort of the ruling bargain struck between the ulama and the al-Saud. So it's very interesting to talk to some of people like the Minister of Religious Affairs in Saudi Arabia, who are, again, very interested in putting forward this idea that Saudi's open for business, and Saudi Islam, we may have had some bad ideas about it in the past, but now we let women drive and you don't have to wear hijab. And these changes are fundamental on the social level. However, traditionally, those sorts of restrictions were justified on a religious basis. And things like statements from the High Council of Ulama saying things about why women couldn't drive, and having a religious justification for this. And so I think the changes, to get to your question about should we believe MBS when he says these kinds of things, I think the changes are fundamental. Saudi Arabia looks very different than it did a few years ago based on everything I observed and heard from people. This is not just the result of MBS. I think it's really important to keep in mind the effects of the massive Saudi scholarship program. And what I heard was there was not a single Saudi extended family which did not have a member that went and studied either in the US or the UK or elsewhere outside of Saudi Arabia. And that program started in 2005. So it's now been 15 years that people have been studying abroad and are now coming back. So I think it's important to remember that while a lot of what MBS has done are seen as very quick, it's this young guy, he's making all these rash decisions, but it is grounded in this new generation of Saudis who do very much support this. And I think as Courtney pointed out, it is coupled with deep authoritarianism to prevent anyone from criticizing it, because this is the Saudi government's future. They have to reduce the size of the public sector, and they have to get off of oil, or that's the end of sort of the House of Saud. And it is also, but it has put the Saudi state in this somewhat awkward position of walking back what it used to justify on religious grounds, and now arguing that they are social. But the changes are fundamental, however you want to frame them. So not to jump on Courtney's expertise, but to just reinforce what she was saying with some specific observations.
In the very, very back of the room, yeah.
Very good. Oh, thanks. Maybe I direct this, Steve Winters, an independent consultant. Maybe I direct this to Courtney in the first instance. I may have missed it, but you don't seem to be placing too much of an emphasis on authority in terms of who's authorized to issue a fatwa. It came up slightly because you mentioned in certain countries that's controlled by the state. Myself, I think in Malaysia, which was way off another part of the world, there's a National Fatwa Council, and according to the law, the government there, they're the only ones who are authorized to issue an Islamic fatwa. And another example would be when Osama bin Laden issued his famous so-called fatwa, there was a lot of discussion about whether he had the religious training or background to be in a position in the first place to issue a fatwa, and so forth and so on. So I just wonder if it came out from your survey, the sense of how the populations felt towards, exactly that, who they would accept a ruling from, and in particular in terms of the leader of ISIS, who, of course, claims that authority.
Sure. So I guess in terms of the Saudi case, the three most trusted religious authorities all came from the Senior Council of Ulama, so the state-linked clergy, essentially. And so, that is the only body that also can technically release religious rulings. So I guess that does illustrate, at least to a certain extent, some buy-in into the institutionalized clerical establishment in Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting is that we see this body being used as a political tool as well in 2011 with fatwa saying that protests were not legit, or were not allowed under Islamic law, and also we've seen kind of more recently these rulings in 2017 about against Qatar to kind of justify the blockade. So it's definitely also used as a political tool, and it seems that at least to a certain extent there is buy-in in that. In the Qatari case, there's not a similar body, so it's a little bit more open. But in that case, there was, again, more, the most trusted religious figures were from that religious establishment. As far as Baghdadi, he had very little support in Qatar in terms of the endorsement effect and in terms of kind of being a trusted religious authority, whereas in Saudi, Baghdadi ranked very low in terms of trust, but in terms of the endorsement effect, we saw that there was some support for statements made by him. So it's a little bit more subtle, but it's definitely there.
Jump in on this as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott, please.
Yeah, so there is a National Fatwa Council in Jordan, and Michael Robbins and Lawrence Rubin have some interesting work showing that its activity actually has increased at moments when the threat from Islamist mobilization seems to be highest. But we didn't ask about this explicitly in the survey, but I do think one thing that's interesting is that very few people said they actually approach religious leaders and ask them for advice or any sort of thing, any sort of assistance. So I'm not sure quite how to interpret that in terms of authority, but it does suggest that in general, people are not going to these leaders for that purpose.
Right here.
Paul Sedfin, Messino Resources, spent a lot of time in the State Department working on a lot of these issues. For Mr. Williamson, a question in Jordan. One of the things that was alluded to earlier is the sort of poisonous embrace of the United States too publicly reaching out to certain religious leaders or trying to work with them. And that was one of your recommendations in Jordan. That is certainly something that's long-term been on the minds of Americans working there in official capacity, given that despite our closeness with the government, the U.S. government's popularity in our own polling has frequently been in the low teens. So we need to be thoughtful of that. I thought if you had some more comment on if you saw doing this in some way that would not soil their credibility, so to speak, by being too political or being too much in bed with us.
So that's a great question, and I could very well just be wrong here in making that recommendation. So that's a real possibility. And I will mention that in the conjoint experiment I mentioned, one of the attributes we asked about was if this hypothetical preacher is engaged in meetings with the US Embassy, and you do see some negative effect on their authority there. So perhaps it's not the best approach. But I do know that USAID, for instance, works with lots of partner organizations, local organizations that are Jordanian, that run some of these initiatives on women's rights, for instance. And so if those organizations and part of their dialogue are the ones involved in this discussion and engagement, I think that would be appropriate and probably not perceived as the US somehow tainting their authority.
Okay, yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Hi, Peter Mandeville from George Mason University. Anel, this is a question for you about Morocco. And I guess I wanted to ask, putting aside specific personalities and kind of named figures, one issue that has come up in the policy discussion from time to time is this idea that Morocco, by virtue of the sort of tendrils of Sufi networks and its strong sort of gravitational impact on religious dynamics throughout North Africa, the Sahel, and into West Africa over the centuries, that the Moroccan religious scene may have considerable influence, in other subregions of Africa. And I wanted to kind of get your sense of that. But then I also wanted to, and I guess this is maybe a mixed Anel and Courtney question. I wonder if you could comment, and actually Jordan, possibly relevant as well, the question of the extent to which some of the efforts that we've seen coming out of certainly Morocco and Jordan in recent years, as those governments have sought to kind of position themselves as purveyors of moderate Islam, sort of service providers for Western security interests in relation to moderate Islam. I've sensed that there's kind of a subtext to some of that that is also about blunting the influence of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi religious establishment in the region, although for regional diplomatic reasons it would never be explicitly discussed as such. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts or insight on that dimension of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll first do the Morocco question and then talk about Saudi influence. Definitely. I think, especially if people are interested in this question of Morocco's sort of broader religious influence throughout North Africa, I think Anne Wainscott has really looked at this. Her work is excellent. And again, this sort of gets to what our survey findings indicated, which was that the king, the Amir al-Mu'minin, does have what is seen as valid religious authority, and that does extend throughout the broader region. And some of this may be due to sort of Morocco's historical role as a center of religious learning. But it is, again, something that the Moroccan state has actively cultivated with outreach to particularly secular African countries, so places like Senegal, for example, which does not have an official religious establishment. And so when they have concerns about Islamists, they don't necessarily have state employees or state imams that they can turn to say, don't say such and such in your Friday sermon, because it is a secular state and they have religious autonomy. And so in cases such as that in Senegal and other secular African countries where they have struggled with this question of extremism, many of them have turned to Morocco, or Morocco has presented itself as an actor that can be turned to for services, as Peter described it aptly. Things such as the Imam Training Center, where people will come from Africa. Imams have come from France. Russia was planning to may have already sent imams to be trained in this moderate Moroccan Islam and then to go back home again, ostensibly to then be able to counteract extremism, but again, sort of increasing Morocco's role and its reputation as sort of the center of moderate Islam in North Africa. I'll quickly get to the second question and then we'll allow for other insights from my co-panelists. But I think it was very interesting both in Morocco, because Saudi is the elephant in the room in so many of these contexts, that anything that national state religious officials are doing is always kind of at the margins of the Saudi hegemony as kind of the leader of the Muslim world, as also this hugely powerful financial actor that has spread their version through training imams, through bringing people to study in Saudi Arabia, through distributing free Qurans everywhere with kind of their translation. And I would argue the Saudi government has checked a lot of that recently, especially post 9/11. There were a lot of concerns. I think Saudi took a hard look in the mirror and acknowledged that maybe some of their religious outreach, which Peter has a big program on at Brookings, as far as sort of religion as a foreign policy tool, Saudi Arabia has pulled a lot of that back and has offered, or this has opened up some space for other actors like Jordan, like Morocco, to sort of present themselves, especially to the West, as these providers of moderate Islam. But I think getting back to that question about Mohammed al-Isa, I think Saudi Arabia is perhaps now moving to maybe retake some of that space and really working hard on this branding effort, this PR effort, to say, what you heard about Saudi Islam before, that's not who we are anymore. Now we're all about the moderate Islam. And so, I think Morocco has managed to build certain relationships in North Africa, also with the EU, and is seen as a very important partner. But they don't rival kind of Saudi Arabia in terms of both religious authority and resources.
Courtney and Scott, you want to weigh in quickly here? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Anel said about kind of Saudi having pulled back. I think one thing that MBS also understands is that there has been reputational damage and that he does kind of acknowledge this. And I guess the narrative now is that, well, Wahhabism originally was this very moderate religion, and it's been, changed over the years, and now it was changed and became extreme, and that doesn't have to do with the origins of Wahhabism. And that's kind of the narrative. I think Muhammad Yahya had an op-ed kind of basically stating that the original Saudi Islam is quite moderate. And so I think MBS is now trying to repackage Wahhabism as this kind of moderate force and force for potentially for good, I guess, in the Arab world.
I don't have much to add to what's already been said. This didn't come up explicitly in my interview, so I don't want to get over my skis, but it definitely sounds plausible.
Okay, let me thank the three panelists. Those of you who have not heard enough, the papers are still available outside, and they're also available online. So please join me in thanking the three panelists.